information, we see that systems thinking, integration, and coordination are all really fundamental for that. We also have the COVID-19 pandemic is now bringing, of course, into stark view a lot of interconnections that exist, from global crises to the economy to poverty, from the connections between the economy and livelihoods, air quality in the economy, mental health issues, social interaction, lots of interconnections coming to light. I think, but importantly, we're at a really critical juncture right now in time where all the sort of the players, the actors involved in planning for sustainable development are at the table and ready to integrate economic, social, and environmental issues. And it's no longer the case where there's maybe just one ministry or a ministry of environment coming to talk about sustainable development, but we have ministries of finance, ministries of planning, health, education, ag, energy, all coming to a table to have these discussions. And but the conversation of those issues and how they're integrated has to deliver, I think, on the promise of sustainable development and this triple bottom line and intergenerational thinking. So the players, the actors at the table, the stakeholders, they want practical tools and institutional mechanisms to make this conversation happen. Unfortunately, now we have 2 decades of experience really behind us with integration tools and institutional mechanisms, and since the World Summit on Sustainable Development, we also have recent advances in systems thinking approaches and computer models, computing power, and advances in how processes for how we engage people in rooms, in complex conversations, experiences with institutions. So. This is what we're here to talk about today, and we have an excellent roster of experts to help get our conversation going today. And I will introduce each of those speakers in the order that they are to speak. And coming up, I'll introduce each one of them. But I just wanted to say just a few upfront sort of organizational things. You can see from the agenda that we do have 2 topics here over the next 2 hours, each 1 hour. The first half hour of each of those hour segments, the speakers will set the stage. We have a speaker and 2 respondents to really help elaborate and provide additional examples. The second half hour of each hour segment will be for questions and discussion. And that segment, that half hour, we'll try to break into 2 parts. The first being specific questions for our speakers to clarify things that have been talked about, and then the latter half for discussion. We have a lot of expertise and experience wrapped up in the over 200, close to 229 participants online right now. And we want to be able to explore some of the expertise and experience and lessons learned that are online with us now. And of course, we also have some questions that were submitted via the registration form. We have 4 guiding questions to get us organized for today, and those were in the agenda. And that's going to help our speakers focus, and it will help our discussion. So if you're a participant, discussion should focus around these 4 questions about what are the practical tools and engagement processes available to assess interlinkages, what are the good practices about feeding modeling outputs and other analyses into plans and strategies, what does country experience tell us about the policy relevance of models and tools, and what are policymakers and priority needs. That's for this first topic. That's going to set the stage for this first topic 3 on interlinkages with tools and processes. And some additional house cleaning items before we march into things. As the slide stated at the beginning, please all mics off during the discussion. That'll help with all the background noise and and video cameras off as well. The speakers, of course, will be able to hear and see the speakers. For the speakers, you'll hear a little bit of a chime, I guess, with about 90 seconds remaining with your time limit. And I will try to be quite stringent on the time so we can reserve that discussion space. And also participants, when we're talking, if you do take the floor for a comment, then 2 minutes will be sort of our limits in order to kind of allow sufficient discussion on various items. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker on the agenda to help set the stage on our first topic, topic 3 on the interlinkages. And we have Mr. Cameron Allen with us from Australia. And if Cameron can turn his video on and audio, and we'll get him set. Cameron's an adjunct research fellow at Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University. He's also a researcher at Pangea Center at the University of New South Wales. Cameron's research focuses on advancing sustainability science to support national implementation of the SDGs. He has worked on with UN organizations, with the Australian government and various research institutes, and all to support countries in implementing the SDGs and also addressing climate change. And he also specializes in statistical and technical capacity building. So Cameron's just the ideal person to set the stage for us here this morning on this topic of interlinkages. And Cameron, I turn the floor over to you for your 10 minutes to set the stage for us. Welcome, Cameron.
Well, thanks, Darren. Just to check you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay,
and I can see you well. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I did have some slides as well. I'm not sure whether they're... so I'm just going to give a very quick overview of some of the main approaches to the linkages. I don't really have time today to go into a lot of detail, but I thought it'd be useful just to use a few slides because some of the outputs from these assessments are very visual and it's difficult to understand the distinctions between them without seeing what those outputs are. So I've tried to map these main approaches to this framework of sort of qualitative on the left-hand side of the screen and conceptual sort of rapid approaches through to more quantitative, dynamic and data and resource-intensive approaches. So sort of starting on the left-hand side there in that first column, you'll see the 5 Ps framework, which you're probably familiar with, which is essentially an integrated conceptual framework. So they allow you to start clustering different goals together to highlight goals that are particularly interlinked. And then you have sort of systems mapping approaches, causal loop diagrams, which again are visual diagram tools which allow you to start exploring, I guess, what some of those interlinkages are between the different goals and the direction of those interlinkages. So they're very simple tools, very high-level tools that begin a discussion, begin a conversation around interlinkages between goals. Moving to the right, you then have cross-matrix analysis, and this approach is generally applied to looking at specific interlinkages between SDG targets. So it's applied at the target level. You take a set of targets that you're interested in the SDGs, and then you take 2 targets at a time and you try to score and describe, I guess, the interlinkages between those 2 targets. They generally use a scale like this one here, where you go from sort of really strong synergy effects, such as indivisible and reinforcing effects, and you score them at a 3 or a 2, through to -3, -2, which are sort of strong trade-off effects, counteracting and cancelling effects. It helps you to start to map out where are the strong synergies and trade-offs across a network or a set of targets that you're particularly interested in, and to start having a discussion and understanding what those trade-offs and interlinkages mean. Moving to the right again, we have sort of network analysis approaches. So these, again, are generally applied looking at interlinkages between different targets, SDG targets. Whoop, please go back to the previous slide. These are, look again at SDG targets, but they provide a sort of deeper and more nuanced analysis. So you're not only looking at impacts between target A and target B, but you're looking at broader second, third, fourth order ripple effects across the whole network of targets that you're looking at based on network theory and using network analysis software. So it can enable you to identify targets that are really central in the network of targets that you're looking at that have a lot of strong linkages with other targets, and potentially a lot of strong synergistic effects. So it can help you identify targets that have strong systemic effects, and presumably one could prioritize targets that have a lot of potential win-win or co-benefit effects across a set of targets that you're looking at. Moving to the right again, we have dynamic modeling, quantitative modeling approaches. So this would include macroeconomic models, integrated assessment models, sectoral models. And I guess a distinction with modeling and the previous approaches I outlined is that models sort of focus on the underlying systems, so they focus on modeling a national economy, society and environment, rather than focusing, sort of taking a target-first approach. You model the underlying system, and within that system are a range of different SDG indicators. So this model, for example, on the screen there is called the ISDG model that we've been using in our research. It has over 3,000 different variables in that model, from GDP, jobs, life expectancy, health, access, a range of different variables, some of which are SDG indicators, about 100 of which are SDG indicators. And what the model then allows you to do is not only explore complexity between the different SDGs and targets and indicators, but also explore the future. So once you have built a model for a country, you can then introduce changes into that model, such as different investments, different policies, and then simulate forward to 2030 and see how those policies and investments actually accelerate or decelerate progress on the SDGs overall, or on specific goals, specific targets, specific indicators. So they have a lot of agency in terms of informing specific policy and investment decisions on the SDGs. And you can begin to explore how a particular investment or a government expenditure or policy setting has effects on a range of different SDGs, both positive and negative. So you can really start to quantify, I guess, what these interlinkages and what these trade-offs and synergies are. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll just touch briefly upon how they generally link with the national planning cycle. So if you look at the more qualitative, semi-quantitative approaches, plus matrix network analysis, they're generally more applied at the sort of the earlier stages in the planning cycle, informing priorities and informing discussions around policy coherence. So they're useful in a workshop setting or discussions between different stakeholders to begin to understand trade-offs and co-benefits, to begin discussion around them, start to introduce system thinking into the planning process, and in particular they're used to prioritize targets. So you're using those approaches to really try to narrow down to targets that have a strong systemic impact, that have the potential for a lot of co-benefits if action is taken to achieve that target. Whereas dynamic modeling and integrated assessment modeling is more used in the policy evaluation stage, so they can be used as policy flight simulators to evaluate different specific policy and investment options, quantify the trade-offs and co-benefits between them. You can provide an assessment of investment needs, so you can assess exactly how much investment would be needed to achieve a particular amount of progress on the SDGs. And you can use them to understand the different structural transformations across the economy and society, as well as sectoral transitions that are needed to actually accelerate progress and achieve the SDGs. So they have a lot more agency in terms of informing specific policy decisions. Okay, next slide, please. Last slide, please. So just finally, I thought it'd be useful just to come back to COVID-19, because it's really what everyone's thinking about at the moment. And I think both the SDGs combined with integrated modelling can provide a really powerful approach to help guide us through the next decade. So I guess we're all sort of in the process at the moment of this short-term response to COVID, and there's been a massive amount of expenditure and investment by governments to try to support households and businesses and financial sector, etc. In the order of around 10% GDP in G20 countries, which is well above what was done during the global financial crisis. But I guess the question that governments are now turning to is the longer-term response. We're going to have crippled economies. We're going to have high unemployment. We need to increase resilience to future pandemics. And I think the SDGs are sort of being framed in a way that they can be used to help us build back better over the next decade. So using the SDGs as a potential framework to guide policy and investment decisions that will determine the shape of our economies into the future. And this is where I think that integrated modelling and the SDGs can be combined to really start to help guide those investment decisions So as I mentioned, with these models, you can, well, the modeling that we've done now in some countries, where we build a national model, we incorporate that country's SDG targets into the model. We haven't yet, but we will incorporate impacts of COVID. And then you can basically look at different policy, tax, revenue, investment, expenditure, private investment, whatever it is, whatever sector that you're particularly interested in. You can start to introduce those settings, generally in the framing of a scenario, policy scenario, simulate forward to 2030 and explore how those different investments, different policies actually support or enable achievement on the SDGs by 2030. So you can search for policy options, you can search for investments that accelerate progress on a broad range of SDG targets, create strong win-wins at the lowest cost. So whether it be all of the SDGs that you're interested in, or a selection of priority targets that you're interested in, these models can help us to understand which options what action we can take now to accelerate progress on GDP, jobs, inequality, health, education, energy, greenhouse gas emissions, resilience, etc., all at the same time. And where are those strong interlinkages, where are the synergies, and where are the trade-offs? So I think my 10 minutes is up, so I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent, Cameron. Thank you very much. That was thank you for the overview of all the different types of tools that are out there. I mean, right from the systems maps to the cross-impact matrices, the network analysis, dynamic modeling. And I love the language around the policy flight simulator. That's really a helpful analogy for people to understand what you can use these tools for to really help with that. And the idea of the workshop settings too. And there's a process that goes around the use of these tools when we get into rooms with people and bridging the science policy interface. So thank you very much for that. I just want to remind our participants that we do the chat space you can use to pose questions for our speakers. If you have a question, type question in the chat just before your chat so we can differentiate it from the other conversations that are going on. So I think maybe in capital letters, type question and then your question after that, and then we'll try to draw on some of these when we come back to our discussion period. If you have a comment that's not a question, just type comment before that as well, and then that helps us sort of parse out the different types of interaction. I see a lot of interaction on the chat space, people introducing themselves from around the world, that we're up to having around 288 participants right now. So fantastic, and welcome everybody that has joined during the talk. Cameron, we're going to move right into our respondents now, and stay tuned when we come back to the discussion, and there'll be some questions for you to address. So thank you, Cameron. We're moving right now. We're going to have two respondents, well, three, in fact, respondents that are going to help us walk through some additional perspectives. And our first respondent is Ms. Jin Xiao. She's the leader of the Strategic and Quantitative Analysis Center at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. Welcome, Jin. She leads a range of research projects at IGES, including SDG interlinkages and analysis and indicators. And she's also works on projects related to green investment, green jobs assessment, integrated assessment of the water, energy, food nexus, and climate policy assessment. So she is uniquely qualified to provide some additional perspective on this topic of interlinkages. Jin, you have 5 minutes for respondent perspectives. I'll give you a chime with about a minute left, and we'll go from there. So welcome, Jin.
Thank you, Alan, for the introduction. Hello and good day from Japan. I'm Jin Zhou, working with the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGS, an environmental think tank based in Japan. Following the previous presentation, I would like to touch upon the first three guiding questions of this session, introducing the SDG interlinkages tool developed by IGS and its applications to support integrated prioritization of SDGs in national development planning, using Ethiopia as a case study. I have some slides. May I have them? Thank you. I don't think this is mine. Yeah, thank you. The next one, please. So through inherent interactions, achieving one goal or target that may impact on achieving others. So for achieving the SDGs in a holistic manner and leaving no one important to shift from a siloed approach to an integrated approach to ensure quality and inclusiveness. Therefore, understanding the interlinkage.
That was really an excellent example of the tools that Cameron had introduced us to. He brought in the visualization aspect, and given the complexity of the issues that we're trying to talk about around the planning table, the visualization part is really important. But then you also get to see under the hood, so to speak, of all the interconnections that are analyzed, and the idea of being able to see the trade-offs and the synergy. So thank you for those examples and the case studies that you had mentioned. Very much appreciated. Participants, again, just if you have questions, specific questions for Shin, you can type those in your chat space and preface it with the word question, and we can come back to that in the discussion segment. We'll move on now to our next respondents to continue this conversation. And we have with us Mr. Matteo Cardicini. He's the Vice President and the Chief Operating Officer at the Millennium Institute. And Matteo is everywhere, so I'm not sure exactly where he's speaking out of. I think it's probably somewhere in Europe right now, but he can remind us where he is right now. Matteo, it's great to have you here again today. It's been a while since we've seen each other. Matteo has been working with the governmental and intergovernmental institutions to develop several national, regional, and global simulation models for the analysis of sustainable development. He holds a PhD in systems dynamics, and his research focuses primarily on sustainable development and integrated planning. And he's got lots of hands-on experience in applying the types of tools that Cameron has outlined. And we look forward to Matteo walking us through the examples that he has. Matteo, are you there? You can turn your camera on now.
I'm here. Can you hear me and can you see me?
I can hear you perfectly. Can't quite see you yet. There we go, Matteo. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good morning, Darren.
The floor is yours, and 5 minutes, and you'll hear a little chime here with about a minute left.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And also, let me say good morning to Cameron, and maybe good evening to Professor Zhu in Japan. Here, I'm in Southern Europe, in Spain, one of the countries that has been more heavily hit by COVID-19. So we're all still locked in for a few weeks. Now, as Darren just mentioned, I've been working for the Millennium Institute now for a number of years, and the mission of the Millennium Institute is really that of supporting countries' government in integrated planning since the time it was founded in 1983. So we've been working with the different suites of models over time to try to support integrated planning. And of course, in the era of the SDGs, we've developed a new suite of models called the ISDG models that are specifically designed for planning around the SDGs. And now, I don't have slides, but I will just put a link here in the chat for those who want to have a look at the online model and try to find out what we're talking here. Now, the SDG model has been developed and applied now in quite some countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and also in Asia-Pacific region, with various types of specific purposes, primarily really to support national planning around the SDGs. Now, I would like to share with you a few of the lessons that we've learned throughout this application. Now, the first lesson, I think, very important one, is that it's important when we get to the stage of really supporting a planning system through quantitative tools, that we do not try to or attempt to model the linkages between the SDGs or the targets. We must be modeling the underlying system, the economic, the social, and environmental system, with all the key indicators and key processes and drivers, so that we're able to capture the interaction not from a high-level perspective where we just make assumptions about this target being connected with that other. But down at the bottom level, really looking at what is the process that is actually taking place. And why is that important? And here, it's an important shift in perspective. Is that whether we're talking about SDGs or a National Development Plan or achieving Agenda 2063 for African countries, the focus is to analyze policy impact. And policies can be very different, although they might have the same purpose of advancing one specific SDG. So trying to measure, for instance, synergies between SDGs, it's directly within SDGs. It's very difficult. It's almost semantically not correct. Right? What we should be looking at is synergies between policies directed to achieve the SDGs. And again, we've been directing a lot of our work in that direction. And I'm posting here also on the chat a link to a recent paper that we did a lot last year on synergies and explaining exactly how we can deal quantitatively with synergies for the SDGs. Now, I know that Cameron has also been applying this type of model for Australia, for instance, and Fiji Islands. So maybe he wants to come back on this and also express a little bit his views on this. Another important lesson that we've learned is that, of course, while the SDGs can provide the overall framework for development, it is important that we look at the existing national plans and see how this can be mapped on the SDGs, not necessarily substituted, but aligned with the SDGs. And part of this is, of course, as also Cameron mentioned briefly, is an exercise of identifying certain priority areas of intervention. Our work is also increasingly focusing on identifying accelerators for the SDGs. Now, we all know that in principle, the SDGs have to be achieved in a holistic manner. And therefore, when we're talking about accelerator, we're not talking about prioritizing one SDG over another or implying any type of hierarchy in those. But we're talking about prioritizing interventions, an area of interventions. Once again, with the idea that one intervention does not necessarily impact only on one SDG, but on multiple SDGs. And therefore, we're increasing our effort now and improving our methodology on the identification of SDG accelerators, as we're doing now in countries like Nigeria, Malawi, Cote d'Ivoire, and others. So I would say that overall, and this is possibly one thing that we can all imagine, this type of technical tools can bring a number of interesting perspectives to the table, a number of very important information, but these are tools for policy analysis and strategy development. When we talk about national planning, we're talking about a process that is made of people and institutions working together. And I think this is the theme of the next session that will come up later in the afternoon. So, in our perspective, the successful use and application of this tool is very much linked to the possibility of institutionalization of these tools, which goes through capacity development, of course, which is an element that is absolutely fundamental, and the ability to transfer this perspective of integrated thinking from just the technical level to the policy level. This is probably the number one factor that we've understood to be really a success factor to cross the bridge from silo planning to integrated planning. A leadership that is able to embrace this integrated perspective. And one can understand, of course, that there are a number of political factors that affect this type of decision. We believe that on the background, a good technical support is fundamental, capacity is fundamental, once again, but eventually it's really a question of embracing this perspective at the leadership level. And I think as Darren in the introduction mentioned, there is more and more of that happening, which is very encouraging, but that we don't have to take for granted. I think those that we've seen are very good positive cases, but across the world, I'm not able, I don't have the number to make up those statistics, but from our observation, it's a process that is slowly coming in.
Matteo, thank you very much. I like that you highlighted this idea of these models helping to identify these accelerators for SDG progress, and that being key. And thank you for the illustration of a lot of the on-the-ground work that you guys do with the ISDG model. And also, thanks for bringing out the idea of capacity and the critical nature, getting from technical application to policy and bringing in the political aspect. So thanks for kind of bringing all the different pieces together in this concrete example of an interlinkages tool. Matteo, I see some good questions already in the chat space for you, which we'll come back to in a moment. So thank you very much. We have, I just want to do a check-in. We have one respondent that's maybe joining us. Is Barry Delisle-Clayton online yet? Barry was to speak yes at the part one and was unable, and then he has lots of sage experience to offer here. And if he is online, we'll have him respond here and provide some perspective. I'll just doing a bit of a check. I see our DEFA colleagues were noting that they haven't seen him online yet. And I think that may be the case. Barry, if you're there, you can turn your mic on. Okay, it sounds like perhaps Barry is not here yet. So we're going to just launch right now into our discussion portion of this first of this topic 3. And thank you very much to the speakers and the respondents for setting that picture. And indeed, I think we can all see that there have been a lot of advancements in the way we do integrated thinking around development, and specific tools now that are being developed to support thinking around the Sustainable Development Goals and the many interconnections that exist out there. So thank you very much, and for the people, the participants online, I see the chat space very, very active. I think we can have perhaps our speakers could probably turn their cameras on, and I'm just going to go to a few of the questions that our DEFA colleagues have been compiling here for us that are coming from the chat space. And I think I'll pose one here to Cameron. An interesting question was posed in the chat space here this morning that deals with sort of the broader aspect, and it ties into the COVID as well. So the question was, how would you go about introducing modeling to guide COVID response using SDGs and in a government that is not already using modeling or systems thinking and decision making? And how can that be introduced relatively quickly? So the question deals with COVID, but it's also, generally speaking, if government is not already using integrated models to think about this, how do we get, how do we introduce that quickly? So I don't know if Cameron can touch on that briefly.
Thanks, Darren, and thank you to the other speakers. Really interesting overviews of different tools. So I guess in response to that specific question, models can be used in a range of ways. In the ISDG model that we were talking about in the context of SDGs is sort of a longer-term development planning model. So in terms of aligning that with COVID, you sort of probably it's more useful for looking at the longer-term response to COVID in terms of building back economies, building back employment, production, etc., over the medium to long term. There are other models available, of course. So pardon me, the ISDG model is built in system dynamics, and there are other system dynamics models which have been built specifically focused on COVID and the health impacts of COVID, and looking at what sort of interventions, you know, whether you introduce a lockdown or track and trace and these sorts of interventions in the short term how those sorts of measures are going to address or not address, I guess, COVID impacts and slow the outbreak. So I guess we're talking about a couple of different issues here. There's sort of really a short-term response to COVID, which can be formed by, I think, better by specific models that focus really on the health sector, on the impacts of COVID. And then there's longer-term planning models which can help inform the longer-term, medium to long-term response to COVID in terms of, well, depending on the priorities of the country, whether it be accelerating growth in the medium to long term, recovering from the crisis, where are those areas of potential growth, where can investments made and interventions be made that will have the greatest bang for your buck, the greatest win-wins across a range of different SDGs. I guess there's a couple of, a bit of a distinction there.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Darren, for bringing in perspective to that question. And thank you, the participant that posed that really pointed and helpful question. We do have online, I do see a question here for Xin. That's helpful too. It gets to the idea of process as well. The question was dealing with what has been the level of engagement, I guess, of governments in some of the cases that you described in the application of the tool, the analysis tool. What has been the level of engagement of the governments in the process of using the tool? Can you elaborate a bit on that for us?
Thank you for the excellent question. Actually, the government's engagement in both the development and application of the tool. For example, we have a project focusing on the achieving sustainable development at the river basin level, particularly for China's Lanhe river basin. And for these projects, actually, we already organized two stakeholder consultations inviting governmental officials from various sectors to gather their opinions related to the cross-border impacts of achieving particular SDG goals in one region and impacts on the other region, particularly the up and downstream relationships. So this is one example that we engage the governmental or stakeholders in the development of the interlinkages at the river basin level. And another example is the application of the tool and the engagement of governmental organizations. The Prime Minister's Office of Bangladesh, they connected with us and consulting on how the tool can be used to support their national priority setting in terms of both budgeting as well as institutional arrangements and setting the priority targets. So we went there and presented our tool and discussed with them about preliminary results of using the network analysis as I presented before, which can be identified as the key targets. And actually, for Bangladesh, they already have their priority targets identified for each of these areas. And also, they have already assigned the specific governmental units in charge of each of the specific targets. So based on our analysis, we also complement their existing priority settings by using the results and also informing how the institutional arrangement and priority settings need to address both the synergies and trade-offs. And so I think these are the two great examples. Thank you.
Xin, thank you for that, and thank you for the question too. I mean, that brings sort of a light to the process and the engagement that goes that wraps around the application of these technical tools, and that's a key part of it. I think we've heard from a lot of stakeholders the importance of the process as, to accompany the application of the technology, of the modeling and analysis tools. And I think, and just I know there's other examples out there of processes, engagement type processes that we've seen. And Odessa's had experience with something called the VISIS approach, Vision Indicators System Innovation Strategy, and that's coming out from the Atkinson Group and Compass Education. That's a process for thinking about these integrated issues. That can include different types of models. I know UNDP has a combos methodology that is a sort of an engagement approach that walks through these kind of conversations. So thank you for elaborating too the engagement aspect of governments in the tool application. Thank you, Sin. Got a question here that came in the chat space for Matteo. I may sort of combine a couple questions here that were quite interesting. One here, and then this one question ties into what Shin was just talking about. Matteo, the question is, what have been some of the challenges that you've seen in operationalizing the ISDG model into policy-making processes in governments? And this question was particularly in developing countries. And how were some of those challenges overcome in operationalizing the tool in a particular context? I don't know if you can elaborate on that for us briefly. And then just to make life even more complicated for you, there was another question here that talked about, can the ISDG model be used to identify and look at the development, peace, security, human rights, humanitarian pillars, so those various aspects? Matteo. Oh, do we still have Matteo on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
There we go.
Sorry. My microphone's still muted.
And you said a lot of really clever things, too, that we missed, and I'm sure you'll be able to repeat them.
Sure. No, I was saying, these are good questions, and there is no definite answer to both of them. Concerning key challenges, I think that I would say the main challenge is at the level of capacity. Not just in terms of technical capacity, but I'm talking about literally time available. Most of the countries we work with have very limited technical staff, and they are normally overcome with different studies and analysis that they have to perform. As a result, they have limited time, and as a consequence of that, the long-term planning, the systemic perspective, is something that is seen as not as urgent, say, as a crisis response as could be for COVID-19. So we're still in that optic where the firefighting mode brings our attention on the short-term dimension versus looking at the long-term. Without, of course, realizing that, of course, it's important to short-term planning and be able to follow the route that we develop, but we must first fix the goals, the objectives, and the route as a framework in which short-term planning can be anchored. Therefore, in general, it's a problem of capacity, and that is reflected, it's not just a question of capacity, but it is reflected more broadly in a disconnect between the short-term planning tools and the long-term planning tools. It's often the case where we analyze the alignment of the national budget with the national development plans or the SDGs, you see that there is a strong misalignment. This is often justified as a necessary adjustment to be made because of the current conditions. But the problem is that current conditions are always there. We always are adjusting to something. And COVID-19 is a clear example. This, I think, also brings another point. I don't have time to elaborate on that too much because we live of the limited time. But it's clear that more and more we enter this phase of last 10 years to the SDGs. Our planning has to be very much oriented towards adaptive management. That is, being able to recognize situations like COVID-19 and respond to that and re-perform our analysis continuously not on a day-to-day basis, but a few times every year in order to adjust to the changing conditions. Now, concerning human rights and political factors, and there are a few elements in this type of modeling that can be reasonably quantified in that domain. Of course, these are quantitative models, and as such, we can only introduce assumptions, shocks, mechanisms as numbers. So we need numbers about the different variables or key performance indicators that we want to check. When we talk, for instance, about peace, stability, equality of governance, rule of law, these are all statistics that exist for mostly all countries, and many of these are embedded in our models. And in fact, just linking to a third question, Darian, so I don't want to take too much time about it, but linking to a third question that mentioned which could be accelerators of growth. Well, these accelerators are very different from country to country, but one that we've seen to be fairly strong accelerators in all the analysis that we've been performing is the quality of governance in the country. So we don't want to generalize yet, just based on chosen or more applications, but this seems to be a very strong accelerator in terms of intervention.
Thank you, Matteo. I did the same thing. I was on mute. Thank you very much for elaborating on all both of those pieces. Much appreciated. I want to come back to just a quick question to perhaps to Cameron, and then a couple of comments that we've received both in the registration forms and also online here, just to round off this first topic for this session. Cameron, we had a question here about, and this is and the other respondents too can maybe chime in on this as well. How accessible and easily available are these models, these types of tools? You had mentioned 4 categories, of course, these systems maps, the cross-impact matrices, the network analysis, and the dynamic modeling. And the question from a participant was about how accessible are these tools to all countries? If you can just sort of comment on that and generally speaking, Cameron.
Sure, Darren, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good question. So if we sort of go back to that framework I presented on the first slide where we had all the different approaches, I think, in terms of the qualitative approaches, conceptual diagrams and things, I mean, that doesn't really require any specific software. You can draw them in Word or in whatever software you may have on the computer. You can draw them by hand if you like. Cross-matrix analysis, well, that framework is sort of based on a publication that came out in Nature in 2016. It's been used by the International Science Council, and you can basically do this type of analysis in Excel. So it doesn't require any bespoke software or anything like that. They're very straightforward, very accessible methods, and those publications, which I'm sure we can share with participants, describe how to undertake these types of analyses. On the network analysis, generally you need a bespoke piece of network analysis software. There's different options for those available. There are some free software options. There's a cloud-based analysis software that I have used in the past called Kumu to run these types of analysis, and one of the images from those was produced using this free network analysis software. It does take a bit of technical understanding on how the software works and what the actual results mean in terms of the different metrics and things that you use, and centrality metrics and betweenness metrics. But all up, those 3 sort of methods, I think, are quite rapid. They don't take a lot of technical capacity, and they can be done fairly quickly. The dynamic modeling is obviously a lot more data intensive. So you need to be able to build a database for a particular country. The ISDG modeling tool, I've used it in my research with an agreement with the Millennium Institute, so perhaps Matteo probably can answer the question around accessibility of the model. It does take some time to build the model, of course, and Matteo can probably talk a bit more about that in terms of building it, working with different developing countries. I've built a model for Australia and one for Fiji recently, and I found it extremely versatile. I mean, they're two very, very different countries, and the model was very flexible and able to model the economy, society, environment in those two different studies. So it's certainly adaptable to probably any country, but it does take some technical capacity. It's quite technical system dynamics modeling. So, but I'd probably defer to Matteo on that.
Thank you, Karen, for that sort of that general overview on accessibility of these tools. I think I'll maybe have Matteo and Xin could maybe put something in the chat space about accessibility of the tools that they described. I think we are going to move on to the next segments here. So I encourage Matteo and Xin to relay through the chat space with colleagues online about their specific tools and their accessibility. Just to end off here, I want to capture a few comments that came through the chat space and also through the registration forms. Just to end off this particular session, this topic, we had in the registration forms we had one colleague that Karamuna Kejaj stated that we need to move this conversation beyond just identifying good practices and approaches for this type of interlinkages. We have to come up with strategies that nudge countries to move towards desired paths on SDG implementation. The comment was, if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that crisis can bring out the best, but also the worst in people, and sadly that includes leaders. Processes and norms stated that can be easily abandoned to meet immediate conveniences, be it social, political, or economic. This is the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed if we want to reach our goals. So I thought this was an appropriate way to end, because this brings in the political economy aspect, the political science aspect of the application of this integrated analysis, and ensuring that we do have processes that are credible, legitimate, that can bring these tools to bear, and just the notion of political will. But this idea of political economy analysis is really quite important. And I know there's colleagues online that specialize in this. I know even Francois Fortier, who is with DESA now down in Chile, I believe, has had a big focus on this area on political economy analysis, and there are new approaches and tools that are available from various organizations that help bring a political economy lens to the picture. And there was also a comment from Paulina Bisotto Molina on the chat space, which was along the similar lines, where she was asking a question about, are there experiences already to integrate political economy analysis to help identify obstacles and opportunities in integrating the 2030 Agenda in national development plans, or more specifically in the adoption of modeling and systemic thinking. You'll see Paulina's comment in the question in the chat space. So I would encourage if there's a bit of conversation in the chat space, if there are colleagues online that have expertise in the political economy lens and these aspects, to carry on a bit of a dialogue in the chat space. I want to thank our speakers and our respondents for setting the stage, and our participants for bringing your perspective and expertise into the questions and the comments on this first topic, topic 3 on the interlinkages part. We saw some excellent examples of tools and the advancement of systems type thinking and thinking about these interlinkages and how these are mainstreamed into the process of integrated development planning for sustainable development. So thank you very much, everyone, for that. We're going to shift gears now into topic 4 on your agenda. And that topic 4 is dealing with institutions for integration and planning, and really getting into the key lessons learned in the whole institutional aspect. And this is, I guess, there is a bridge, I guess, from the topic 3 to topic 4, in that in topic 3 on the application of these technical tools, these analysis tools, there's always a process that needs to go along with that allows people to get in the room, to get the conversation started on these interlinkages, and then to maybe perhaps spin off side groups to do more detailed analysis, which then can report back to a broader group to understand and digest these and report these to decision makers. So there's a process of engagement and co-creation involved in applying these tools. Now, we're kind of taking it to a more of a meta level in this topic 4, and at the institutional level, looking at coordination, integration, coherence in this integrated planning space. And lots of advancements as well have happened over the years, and still some challenges remaining. And we've got an excellent roster of speakers and respondents to get us going here. And I noticed too that Barry is online now at the Clayton. Barry, we're going to put you on notice here. We'll add you to the respondent list here in this topic 4, and you'll be able to reflect both on the institutional and on the interlinkages as tools, because you do have a great sort of a history of seeing how this has evolved over the years. So, Barry, just putting you on notice here to be on the respondent list here on this topic. But to set the stage here for the topic 4 on institutions, we're very fortunate to have Mr. Louis Muehlman online here with us. And Louis, it's great to be able to see you again. And you can turn your camera on now and get ready to speak. But Louis, he's a member of the United Nations Committee on Public Administration and a co-chair, in fact. He's also a visiting professor with the Public Governance Institute at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Louis, he has a PhD in public administration and a Master of Science in environmental biology. So he sees this interface here from a lot of angles. And he works with the European Commission in Brussels as a coordinator of environmental implementation review. Louis, we're very excited to have you here to help set the stage for us. So, Louis, please do turn on your camera and your mic now if you are with us.
So, Darren, I have put my mic on.
I see. Where your volume's coming in pretty low, Louis. If you could speak up.
And my camera is, I see myself upside down. Do you see?
It's upside down.
Exactly. I wanted to give a different perspective.
I love it. I love it. I can always rely on you to do something here that turns things on their head. So thank you very much.
The mistake, I mean, it's not a mistake, it's a software problem. As you can see that I'm not an IT specialist, I'm just a practitioner in governance. And,
Louis, I'll have to ask you just to speak a little closer to the microphone, just so the volume comes up, and then I'll give you a chime with about 90 seconds left in your 10 minutes response. So thank you, and then please take the floor.
Okay, thanks. I will try. And I will look a bit strange now because I have to look up to the camera is in the wrong place. Anyway, I'm a part-time academic, but mostly a practitioner since almost 40 years in various government organizations, and that means that I'm not working in the world of professional models, terms of modeling through, or even the concept of a policy cycle, policy.
Louis, I'm just going to have to interrupt you just for a moment again. I think it's probably the case for a lot, though, that your audio is not quite coming through enough. It's fading in and out a bit. Is it possible to get closer to your microphone?
Well, I'm already.
It seems to kind of fade in and out a bit.
Thanks. I put an off on the off. Is it better?
Yes, that was good. I could hear you right then.
Okay, this is better. So I just tried it again. Okay, I will try. Let's see. I'm sorry that time is not coming through. Okay, so I suppose I have still like 8 minutes left, but I need my 10 minutes, I must say. Thanks for the opportunity to share a few reflections. First thing is that COVID-19 has been an equalizer. All governments have fixed central command and control mechanisms of governance. Some that was a big change. Others it was not, of course. But the surprise, and that is the first lesson learned, I think, that such a sudden switch is possible. In other words, big transformations are possible. That's good to know. We will need at least more faster and maybe some at the same time. So the new normal will be, in any case, with formal and central institutions. At the same time, integration and mainstreaming the SDGs means it remains contextual. There are almost no best practice. The exception is maybe that the institutional coordination of SDGs should be with the Prime Minister's office. Even that may not be necessary if Finland, the Prime Minister, is not super boss, but the number one among her peers. Even a National Sustainable Development Plan can have very different shapes. It can be a classical strategic plan of 200 pages. Strategy can also be seen as a permanent learning project. And the focus is then on strategizing planning. The point is here that each national culture and tradition has a kind of a natural preference for a specific type of institutional framework. For a hierarchical culture, public institutions are formal and legal, centralized. In such cultures, most offices in the ministries have law. In Germany, successful ministries are the ones that produce most laws. In France,
Louis, sorry. Louis, it's Darren again. Sorry to interrupt. We're just sort of paying attention to the chat space here on the audio aspect. I think there's so we'll have to try a couple of things here. Participants, I guess, on your end, you'll have to turn your volume up, I guess, maybe as high as you can on your computers as participants. But I'm not sure if, Louis, if you're able to position maybe notes close to the microphone and maybe have your voice as close to the microphone as possible, because I think it's difficult for a lot of people to hear from what I'm seeing on the line.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know.
That's better.
Is this a little bit better?
Yes, that's better. I know you're getting really close to us now with that, but that's really helping.
I can do it like this. Okay. So sorry. Let's try. So,
that's good.
what I was saying was that in national cultural traditions, there are different ways of looking at institutions, and could be more top-down or more market-oriented cultures. Public institutions are small and efficient. In network cultures, they are more informal and based on trust. In reality, we always have mixed forms. But I do not believe in best practices that apply everywhere. There's also no empirical evidence that they rather that they don't. Still, almost all of us use the term best practice if it's something real. In order to speed up the implementation of the SDGs, we need, beyond crisis management, to increase the number and scope of fast-track policy initiatives without replacing experimental innovation. Fast-track SDG implementation cannot be organized without taking risks. It's possible without trial and error and without failure. This we need to accept. But risk-taking is not exactly a popular issue. We need institutional systems that reward some level of failure instead of punishing. I heard about a research organization, for example, who has a target that a failure rate of not less than 5% might make sense, not for a Ministry of Justice, though, but in general might make sense. One area where we might be able to speed things up without too much risk is multi-level government. Top-down and bottom-up relations between the different levels of government are both characterized by slow transfer of innovative ideas. European law, for example, on waste recycling can take 7 years before it finally ends at the local level where it has to be implemented. For implementation of SDG challenges which are complex and urgent at several administrative levels, we need to add a third approach, and this I call real-time collaborative model governance. Shift of mechanisms bring together people at government levels at the same time. Not an exotic exist in some countries like the Netherlands, may be more difficult. Cultural settings has to be tried. Important. Another early lesson is that effective public governance remains contextualized. Big disasters and others can be equalizers, and some governments will try to maintain a state of emergency longer than necessary.
Louis, just sorry to interrupt again. Just for the last portion here of your talk, maybe try to keep close to the mic. You drifted a bit away, and that little bit of distance seemed to make all the difference in the world in terms of the audibility of the speaking. So unfortunately, you got to stay so close to us.
No, I don't want that. No, and
that's good. We love it when you're really close to us.
I'm doing this the whole day, and now it's suddenly the connection is bad. Okay, so one lesson I said is about contextualization again. We always need, if we want to do some real societal change for sustainability, we need to have it founded on people's values and traditions and history. That's different in different countries. Another lesson now, especially from the COVID crisis, is about rediscovered the value of the public sector. Countries with a functioning public sector that caters for essential health services for all are better equipped to deal with the pandemic than others who face privatized healthcare. That is an example we've seen in many places. COVID-19 has shown that countries who went too far in this respect, the privatization of the public task, had to beg other countries to help them with intensive care, hospital beds, and other medical equipment. Also, long-term thinking is typically lacking in privatized versions or small government versions of government. Foresight teams, independent advisory council have been abolished in many countries in the last 10 years. So, and to go further, as the economist Mariana Mazzucato says, the whole public sector has suffered under the impact of economic theories that promoted small and efficient but ineffective government that have resulted in the privatization of vital public functions. The lesson here is that we need to reassert the central role of an effective, responsible, and capable public sector in responding to society's needs. Part of this should be the recognition that we need institutional support for healthcare workers and all the other people who are doing what we suddenly realize are critical jobs. Political scientists call them street-level bureaucrats. They are the new heroes of our time. Their salaries are low, and they can often not spend enough time to do their job adequately. We also need institutional reform to focus on sustainable budgeting and financing. We cannot afford that COVID-19 funds support an unsustainable future. Making the wrong decisions now will not just delay the SDGs, but get us into a for a long time. I will get to the last comment. Adaptivity to shocks is based on resilience. SDGs are a holistic concept, which all goals are linked to each other and cannot be singled out. That's a systemic approach which will lead to more resilience in our society against shocks. But public institutions' first reactions to external shocks is normally the turtle. Close the windows, close the doors, then your eyes, and hide under the table. That's logical because normal public sector institutions were not invented to be flexible, to be innovative, to be agile. They are there to keep things as they are, to be reliable, to be predictable, stable in the first place. That's a good value. But to prepare for the next pandemic or other crisis, you need to be able to combine stability with flexibility. Adaptivity is much easier when you have access to IT infrastructure and tools, but we see now that the digital divide is everywhere and has been growing stronger than ever since the outbreak of COVID-19. Many countries cannot continue public services should be during the crisis because of a lack of IT tools. To conclude, I'm very happy with the rediscovery of the public sector and the critical importance of effective governance. But just like the economy, the public sector does not exist for itself. It is there to serve the needs of the people and to respect and protect planetary boundaries. This we need partnerships between governments, private sector, and civil society. Such partnerships to be successful, we need strong government.
Great. Thank you, Louis. soldiered through on the audio, and I think a lot of people on the chat space were interested in the paper that you're basing a lot of your thoughts and comments on. So if you're able to put in the chat space a link to any relevant the publication that for this, I think participants to be appreciated. And I can see in the chat space also that a number of participants have already noted links to your work and have been putting them in the chat space for people to get further information. And that's fantastic. And in fact, I've got your book on meta-governance sitting on my bookshelf here behind me. So, so we know there's lots of information there that you were drawing on in this. And we will come back to you with some more questions in a little bit here. And I see our participants are now starting to put questions in the chat space. So you may want to take a preview of those. Even feel free to actually chat back a bit too while things are going on as well. I do want to now move on to our first respondent now, so moving, I guess, from Louis providing the big picture and setting the stage for us in talking about the meta-level discussion, risk, multi-level governance, sort of the challenges of getting policy to the ground and the timing that takes, and the value of the public sector. And so a good segue now too is our first respondent in this topic 4 is Ms. Maria Margarita Cano. She's the advisor to the Secretary of Planning and Programming in Guatemala. So this is an excellent sort of perspective to have right at this very point in the conversation. Since 2018, Maria has worked with the Secretary of Planning for the integration of the 2030 Agenda, and she was the coordinator of Guatemala's second voluntary national review in 2019. So Maria has a lot of perspective now on the 2030 Agenda and its implementation from a country perspective. Maria also holds a Bachelor in International Relations and a Master's in International Development, Cooperation, and Policy. So lots of expertise, experience, and perspective to bring here to this conversation. And Maria, for a respondent, 5 minutes to provide your perspective. I'll give you a little bit of a chime here with about a minute left. So Maria, if you are online, if you could turn your camera and mic on now, you may take the floor.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Video not showing up yet, but the voice is perfect.
My video is on.
There we go. Yeah. Your video is on. Yeah.
I do have some slides, so if I could, I'm going to talk about the integration of the SDGs in national planning instruments, especially the country case of Guatemala. Just full disclosure, I'm not a COVID-19 expert. So I will try to focus on some kind of lessons learned from planning in the last few months, but as you know, this is all ongoing. So I'm focusing first on the integration in the planning level. So if I can have the next one, please. Someone just mentioned in the chat a few moments ago the experience that Guatemala had with an interlinkages study done with ECLAC a couple of years ago, where we integrated the SDGs with our national development plan at the target level, and we did a network analysis for the interlinkages where we found critical targets that gave us 10, what we call the national development priorities. Now, are like the mix between the national development plan and the SDGs, and where we found those critical targets that have more interlinkages to other targets, and therefore is where we should focus most of our efforts first. So that exercise was like done in between 2017 and 2018. If I can have the next one, please. And then we have a very particular situation where we had a government change last year. We had elections in 2019, and therefore we had to formulate from the Secretariat of Planning a new government general policy. That's the 4-year policy instrument to guide planning and budget for this government administration. So we basically did an alignment of the government's plan and the long-term development agenda that we had already integrated. Obviously, the new government administration had a government plan. They had some policy priorities, and therefore we had to align to that plan that had been the electoral offer of the government with, for the short term, with the long-term development agenda. So we basically mixed the SDGs with our national development plan, and now we added the government plan for the next 4 years to make sure that everything is in line. That gives us the government general policy goals for the next 4 years. Can I have the next one, please? So we basically see this as we have a long-term development growth map, and our national development plan goes up to 2032. So we see it as each government must implement like each segment of this long-term roadmap. And that was like the logic behind the integration for the government general policy for the next 4 years. I can have the next one, please. So this is an example of how we matched and how we aligned and integrated the goals. On the bottom in the slide, you can see that the government plan, like during the electoral campaign and such, there was, for example, a goal that says we will invest in agricultural insurance scheme for small producers. And that turns into a goal in the government's general policy that says that for 2033, the amount of financing for agricultural insurance for small producers will be increased up to 35 million quetzales, that's our currency. So, and that is in line with SDG 2, with the target 2.3. So basically, it's an exercise where we kind of measured what the long-term goal would be and what this government task would be for these 4 years. We have several other examples on how we did this, and in summary, we reached 50 specific goals for the government's general policy that are aligned to the SDGs and to the national development priorities that we had already defined. So this, one of the questions that I saw in the previous, the questions that participants sent previous to the webinar stood out to me. That is said, why are we still talking about integration 5 years later from the adoption of the SDGs? And that made me think a lot because we had the first 4 years where we did the integration like at the formal level, like we did all these interlinkages studies and we saw at what level could the integration be and this and that. But now we're the implementation of that integration in the short term. So we have to put that integration in practice now. And one key aspect of that is continuity. And I think many countries know that government changes may imply policy changes, but we have to make sure that the short-term policy is in line with the long-term development roadmap, and planning institutions are key for that. Just making a little addendum on the COVID-19 issue. We see that now we have a really big challenge to guarantee that coherence with the short-term immediate response versus the long-term goals. As planning institutions, we are used to working for long-term plans or medium-term plans, or even maybe the shortest term is a year or 5 years, and now we're forced to make some plans in an immediate term. The Secretariat, for example, has been working the government intensely on making the COVID-19 response plan in Guatemala, which we had early in March, thankfully, and this has been a very good precedent for this administration, considering we took office in January. So this challenge of making sure of the short-term coherence with the long-term development goals, I think, is one we're all facing, and we're learning from along the way in this emergency. So I will leave it there right now, and feel free to ask any questions.
Maria, that was just an excellent across-the-board sort of sharing of the experiences in Guatemala, and the offices and the posts that you hold are so relevant to this conversation here right now. You'll see in the chat space a number of questions being directed your way, so you may want to preview those here as we come back to the discussion here shortly, and some of them relating to the challenges, I guess, of transitions in government and how do we sort of maintain the connection between them. So thank you very much for that. We will move on now to our next respondents and then we have two more respondents, and then we're going to come back to a question and discussion with our speakers again. But just to move on, we have our next speaker. Oh, sorry. Before we do move on, I just wanted to note there have been some posts in the chat space regarding availability of the presentations, and I believe, yes, the presentations will be available, and there'll be information. There's a lot of good information in the chat space being posted, a lot of good sharing on the topics as the speakers are speaking, and that information will be, of course, saved before the end of the webinar and made available as the appropriate parts of the conversation for participants. Our next respondent is Ms. Anita Brewer. She's a senior fellow with the German Development Institute in Germany, of course. And Dr. Brewer, she received her PhD in political science from the University of Cologne, and her primary research interests involve governance, accountability, and participatory politics, so really spot on for this conversation. And as well as the impact of digitalization on political behavior and collective action, so quite an interesting perspective there. She currently directs an interdisciplinary team, a research project on implementing the 2030 Agenda, integrating growth, environment, equality, and governance. And Anita, 5 minutes roughly for your intervention. I'll try to give you a little chime, heads up with about a minute left. And I will ask you, Anita, you could turn your camera on and your mic. And then I may ask Maria if she could perhaps turn her camera off, and then Anita turn hers on. Okay.
Do you hear me there?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, my camera. Okay, perfect. Yes, thanks for the kind introduction. I don't have much to add to this at this moment. Of course, Margarita, just like you, I'm not a COVID-19 expert. I guess very few of us are. But to my mind, probably one of the most important institutional lessons from the corona pandemic is that it has once more demonstrated the importance of multi-level governance, but at the same time also the difficulties of achieving it. And that's what I'd like to speak about, I guess, mainly from a political science perspective. So we have seen a great deal of variation in impact of COVID-19 within countries. And it is totally clear that subnational governments are at the forefront of immediate crisis response, but also longer-term crisis recovery. And so in a situation like this, a strictly hierarchical and top-down approach will not work because it's simply not adaptive enough to local realities, obviously. But neither will a purely bottom-up approach work, because local governments often lack the financial, the technical, and the knowledge resources to develop and to implement the necessary strategies without the support of the central government.
So I totally agree with Louis, something that Louis said, although it was unfortunately so difficult to understand, and that for a quick response to urgency situations like these, we need mechanisms for real-time collaborative multi-level governance. However, as we now observe how countries struggle to get this balance between centralized and decentralized action right, I'm also not sure whether I share Louis' assessment that in this area will help us to speed things up without much risk. Of course, I mean, seeing what has been happening, clearly the worst thing or the biggest risk that can happen in such a situation is a disjointed response in the sense of, passing the buck to other levels of the government or engaging in blame shifting for the sake of short-term political or popularity gain. But even in countries where the federal executive is undertaking serious efforts to coordinate national and sub-national level action, it turns out that this is really difficult. Like, to give an example here from Germany, what we have observed is that multi-level coordination works quite well in the first phase of crisis response. However, now that, this whole thing is dragging on and we're getting into a second phase, it is becoming a lot more difficult for our Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, to rein in the regional government. And so here in Germany, what we hope will be the return to normality is becoming a patchwork of different regional exit strategies. And in some cases, these strategies seem rather rushed and more suiting the political agenda of governors rather than the health and safety needs of regional populations. Now, am I talking about this? I think that the institutional lesson that we can draw from this is that decentralizing SEC action also comes at a cost. Because on the one hand, there are financial costs that are related to the creation of additional structures for the coordination of implementation and monitoring and evaluation of SDG projects at lower levels of government. Those are the financial costs. But then on the other hand, there are also political costs. Because when coordination is undertaken between different levels of government that have diverging policy priorities and that have diverging political agendas, then decentralizing SDG action may also involve the risk of diluting that action. And judging from the findings of our own research, I'd say that there are indications that many national governments seem to be wary of these costs and that they therefore seem to be shying away from giving sub-national governments a formal seat at the table when it comes to SDG implementation. In the context of our project at DIE, we have been working on the creation of a data systematically maps governance approaches for SDG implementation, and that is based on the description that countries provided in their DNR. So far we have coded the DNRs that were presented between 2016 and 2018, and we have roughly 100 country cases in our database. And one criterion that we are looking at is whether subnational governments are formally and permanently represented in the national body that has been created for the coordination and oversight of SDG implementation. And we found that this is the case in only 30% of the countries in our sample. Now, another way that you can go, and another 15% of countries decided to invite subnational governments to technical working groups or technical committees that continuously consult and provide input to the national SDG implementation body, but that do not have any formal decision-making power. So this is another way that you can go, but that still leaves us with more than half of the countries that are not engaging the subnational level in a formal and permanent manner when it comes to SDG implementation. And I think it is very important that we conduct more empirical research to learn about the context factors that drive these decisions. If we want to identify entry points for international support of multi-level governance in SDG implementation. But for instance, it could be that really in more developed countries, the decision to not formally involve the subnational level may be more related to the political costs that I mentioned earlier. So that in poorest countries with low levels of state capacity, the decision to not decentralize SDG action may rather be motivated by the fact that the subnational levels of government simply lack the necessary financial resources and technical capacities to comply with that mandate. And so if that is where this call for multi-level approaches in SDG implementation hits the hard reality of the developing world, then we will have to find ways to deal with it by developing custom tailored support if we really want to build back better. Yes, and I mean, for those who are interested in our research and database, I'm copying a link to a paper that we did based on the data from the VNR 2016 and 17. We've since updated our database with data from 2018 and present findings in the Global Research Symposium in Utrecht. That's upcoming in June. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. You touched on so many really critical and important facets. This whole idea of sort of the distributed, decentralized decision-making, and whether it's through crisis recovery or SDG implementation, that's sort of that finding that special combination, I guess, of the need for top-down sort of support, but the on-the-ground implementation is where we really sort of the adaptability lies, because the people working most closest to the ground are able to respond to these unanticipated issues. So that's, and then you noting how we need to find that blend. So that was actually a really critical aspect, and I see some conversation here picking up of course, in the chat space. So I encourage Anita to keep an eye on the chat there as well in terms of additional conversation on this topic when we come back to the discussion. So thank you very much, Anita. I do want to check in here. We have one more response before we get back into questions and discussion. I just want to check if Barry is online now. And if so, Barry, could you turn your video and your mic on so we can confirm that you're there? Maybe DESA colleagues could send me a note here if you see him online still. I know he was on a little bit earlier. All right, Barry, are you out there? We'd certainly like to hear from Barry, because he's got about 49 years of experience here on sustainable development, mainstreaming, and integration to bring to the conversation. Okay, all right. I think Barry is online. Barry, are you able to turn on your mic and your camera? Okay. All right, not working. If that tech issue sorts itself out, we'll get back to Barry. But I think we're going to move now right into the questions and discussion. And thank you, everybody who's online, who've been using the chat space so effectively and carrying on conversations and sharing information. That's certainly one of the benefits of having an online environment is having that interaction that can move on the sidelines of a discussion here. I want to move to a few questions here in the chat spaces, and continue to add your questions as well, colleagues. I'm going to sort of go. Well, I guess we'll work backwards. I guess through speakers here, and we'll come to, I guess, Maria. The question I did put you on notice for, I guess, was that transition question that was posed by a participant. Was obviously an interesting and practical one in terms of what lessons were to be drawn from the change of government regarding challenges of ensuring continuity in SDG action across administrations. I think that's a question that is always on people's minds. It's not as if the integration aspect is complex enough, but when we do have changes, that also creates complexities, and that's where, I guess, of course, institutions come in and play a huge role. So, Maria, some thoughts?
Hi. Thanks. Yeah, I saw that this was a recurring question in the chat. And yes, as you said, there's not only integration challenging enough, but now we have to add continuity continuity as well. Yeah, there are several lessons learned. One of them is that we have a very special moment last year because due to electoral law reform, we had a longer transition period between governments. We had almost 6 months between the election and the government taking office. So that allowed us as a planning institution to start working with the elected officials with enough time. So we could inform them about the integration exercise and all the background information. Another advantage is that the approval, maybe approval is not the word, but we have this multi-level mechanism that is the Development Council, and the National Development Council is composed of not only the executive branch, but civil society and several other sectors, and that council is the one that approves and has the task of following up on the development agenda. So that one, the other actors remain, even if the executive branch changes through a government transition. So the National Council is still very much in depth with the integration process and the National Development Plan. That is a long-term commitment, even if government changes. And that exercise of aligning and integrating what the government plan, the electoral plan was, with the goals, and seeing as we are all talking about development, maybe the emphasis is a little bit more on this side. For this government, maybe the emphasis is more on that side, but seeing as the long-term goal should always be development, we managed to have those discussions thoroughly in those months of the government transition, and that was helpful for integration and continuity for the government's general policy. We will have to check up on the implementation. As I told you, we took office in January, so we're starting to implement this along the way, and we'll see how it goes. But those were two key factors, I think. Putting a lot of work into the transition and having an external body that's beyond only the executive branch to ensure continuity.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. That was extremely helpful, I'm sure, for a lot of people online. And just touching on the aspect of National Council and the role that the National Council played in continuity in the example you provide, I think can be shared from other contexts as well. I know certainly, I'm knowing of the German Sustainable Development Council, Finland, and others as well. That is an important role played there. I'd encourage in the chat space too, if there are experiences with other institutional mechanisms, national councils or interministerial bodies that have helped with the continuity aspect, as well as the integration, of course, to share those in the chat space for everybody. Maria, thank you very much. Stay tuned, because there's probably some other questions you'll likely be able to chime in on and provide perspective. I want to move to a question now for Anita. We did receive one in the registration process that I think is good to sort of have a bit of perspective on. And the question was from Andrea Spencer Cook from out in Australia. She was noting the question was, where national integration is lacking, what are the most successful bottom-up strategies that state governments can take for localization and integration? I thought maybe from the participatory perspective, Anita, and the research that you're doing and the experience, perhaps that bottom-up mechanisms and effective approaches. What were some thoughts of yours?
Yeah, that's a very valid question, because the next thing that we wanted to do once we have completed our database, because at this moment it is merely descriptive, right? So what do these bodies for SDG implementation look like? How are they composed? And then in the next stage, run a couple of regressions in order to see how are these institutional design choices related to complex sectors, right? For instance, have countries with a higher level of democracy more of a tendency to include non-state stakeholders and have them participate in their national SDG implementation body. Or another, like building on my presentation, another hypothesis could be in countries where we have a very low level of state capacity, we will have a tendency of, the sub-national level not being involved because they lack these capacities. But of course, even where there is the level of state capacity is low, so that the central government cannot govern right through to the local level. What you see there is substitution, is where, like informal networks of civil society come to the fore and are taking on these tasks that the central government, for lack of capacity, cannot fulfill. And then, of course, in regards to transnational support, what we would have to do is to support these informal networks in order to foster, bottom-up action.
Sorry, I was just muted there for a moment. Thanks. And just while we have you sort of right on the camera, another question just popped up from Sweden that I guess is touching similar aspects here. We have Jonas Friedman coming in, and obviously his comment was happy to hear about the relevance of the local and regional level in the implementation of the SDGs, and often forgotten about in the debate. He noted in Sweden the activity on local and regional level is high. I wondered if you have any thoughts regarding the need for coherent policies at the national level in order to facilitate implementation at the local level. I guess that's that top-down, bottom-up sort of sandwich, I guess. I guess it's not only the importance in involving the local and the regional, I think it can be a challenge. So the merging of the two, any sort of thoughts on where do they meet and the approaches that help?
I wish I had the perfect answer to that, and I've been, wondering a lot about what the right approach here is, and I actually would like to engage with people on the floor in this discussion. Because then, of course, when it comes to localizing the 2030 agenda, one way of doing that is to also build these, what I talked about, our analysis of SDG implementation bodies at the national level. But then, those kind of councils or implementation bodies can also be set up at a regional or sub-national level, depending on what the form of a state organization of the country is. But I often wonder whether that is actually the way to go. Especially for poorer countries, because the creation of these new structures will absorb financial resources. And in the countries where we did, because ours is mainly a desk research, so we did field research in a couple of countries, and what I noted in several cases is that where these SDG implementation bodies have been, formal SDG implementation bodies have been set up at the regional or local level, they don't seem to be very well connected to other relevant actors, the formal actors or civil society actors. They're basically, or in many cases, remain like toothless tigers. And then I'm asking myself, what's the sense of building these bodies? Wouldn't it make more sense to mainstream the principles of the 2030 agenda into bodies that already exist, or organizations that already exist and are located at critical intersections? I'm sorry I forgot about her name, the lady from Japan. She talked, for instance, about river basin organizations. So I think it would be more important that those existing organizations, that capacity, SDG capacity building and awareness raising about interlinkages would be done within these institutions rather than building up weak new institutions that cannot really achieve much. But open for discussion, of course.
Yes, and thank you. I mean, that's obviously this is a space here that is, and why meetings like this are held to kind of flesh out where the areas for more conversation and work are, and that's of course good information for DESA and how to continue these conversations on integration and institutions. Thank you very much, Anita. Louis, I want to just turn back to you here before we turn the floor back over to DESA to close things out. I wonder if you might want to, if you feel you might want to expand a bit on the question that Anita was just addressing in terms of where the top down meets the bottom up. And there was also a question in the chat space, and I'm not sure whether you can touch on this or not, but it was asking about any sort of findings on the impact of COVID-19 in fragile and post-conflict contexts where public governance is normally weaker. If you want to expand on that one. So a few minutes, just a few minutes there, Louis, and then I'll put Emson on notice that we'll turn the floor back to him to close things out. Louis, how are you on? Okay, excellent. There you go.
How's the sound?
That sounds good.
Good. I don't know. I shook my machine and stuff. Okay. Indeed, so on multi-level governance, why doesn't it really work? Get it faster and more meaningful. One thing is that I think it is a matter of mindset also. The mindset that you should not work together if you, because you could lose power, you could lose information if you work together across the levels. And it's also actively discouraged. I work at the European Commission in Brussels, the executive of 27 countries, and the member states in these 27 capitals don't really like it when we have direct contact with local authorities. We do that, and we like to do that because there's a lot of innovation. That's the hubs for innovation, local level usually, or the subnational level. It is a matter of working with silos, and I always use them the metaphor not breaking down the silos, but teaching them to dance, teaching silos to dance, about connecting. And I saw François Fortier, if you're still there, making a point about power relations between actors. Oh.
Louis, I think you have to keep moving closer to the mic here for the last segment here.
So, okay, so it is about silos and teaching silos to dance. It's about power relations, understanding the power relations, and the trade-offs between different actors is very, very important. Only then, if you know that, you understand that if you work with different actors, multi-level or multi-actor, multi-sector, only if you know the relations, you understand the relations, then you can start working together to something what is called joint fact-finding, for example. So, and then you can start using models we heard in the first hour. But without that, it's often not possible. And then the last question you raised on of course. Right,
Louis, I think we'll need to defer that last question, perhaps. Maybe you can add something in the chat space for in post-conflict countries. If there's some information you have that you can make available to participants on that. I'm looking at the clock here. I do want to bring this in right on the hour. So thank you, Louis, for tying up both the first session, the topic 3 and topic 4, where the models come into play. And how the two institutions and models interact in dealing with this whole integration issue. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank our speakers and respondents for bringing the expertise, the experience to these two topics that we covered here in the past 2 hours. And I want to thank participants particularly for sharing your experience in the chat space, your questions. I know we still got a large number of people online, and thank you everybody for participating and bringing your experience and curiosity to the chat space and the questions and the information that we've been exchanging both in the chat and through the presentations DESA will make available at the link that was provided in the chat space. I wanted a special thanks also to the DESA colleagues who are working behind the scenes here in operationalizing this online forum and adapting quickly here under the COVID situation to bring the originally scheduled expert meeting, in face-to-face one into an online setting, and working and adapting over the past few days to make the technology work, and working behind the scenes with the speakers and all the systems in place. I know it's a challenge as everybody's trying to adapt and transition to the online environments. And thank you very much for all the hard work at DESA there behind the scenes, getting questions organized for the conversation and everything. So thank you very much. I want to now turn things over to back to Anson Savanda, who's the Chief of the National Strategies and Capacity Building Branch at DESA, to close out the meeting for us today. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Darren, for a wonderful job today. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Mr. Alex Tratakoff, Officer in charge of the Division for Sustainable Development Goals, as well as all my colleagues who have worked behind the scenes to organize this webinar series, I would like to thank all our panelists and everyone who took time from their busy schedules to participate in this webinar series on integrating the 2030 Agenda into national plans and strategies, considering COVID-19 response and recovery. I think you will all agree with me that all the presentations and the discussions were top-notch. So a round of applause to everyone. Promoting the integration of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as reviewing the progress we have made in implementing this agenda, is a top priority for all countries. And the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the imperative to speed up the implementation of this agenda in all countries. As we close this session, I would like to inform you that we'll be preparing key messages from the webinar series on Tuesday as well as today, and we'll be posting them on our website, sustainabledevelopment.un.org. So I will not go through any key messages in my summary today, but we'll be making them available shortly. Many of you have also requested for the PowerPoint presentations and the recordings of the webinar series. These two will also be posted on our website, so you can check on our website anytime soon. I think we should be able to do it. Otherwise, I hope that this webinar series has provided you with new insights and tools that you may use in your national context to integrate the 2030 Agenda into national plans and strategies. Let us continue to work together to ensure that no one is left behind. Finally, I thank all of you for your participation, and I look forward to engaging with you in the near future. And we hope to have an in-person expert group meeting here in New York when the situation gets back to normal. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.